Good afternoon and welcome back to this webinar. We will start the third session, which addresses opportunities for sustainable development in the medium term. The first theme is innovation and industrial policy, harnessing the knowledge economy. We are addressing an important issue on how to turn innovation and industrial opportunities to real opportunities that can build a strong and sustainable economy, benefiting from the knowledge economy that has become a basis for development in our modern times. We are happy to have Dr. Grace Khoury, member of our board of trustees, to moderate the session. To also welcome Mr. Zain Abu Daqqa, the researcher who prepared the paper from the Institute for Social and Economic Progress. And we expect his paper to introduce us to new horizons to understand the importance of the role of innovation and industrial policies in sustainable development. We also welcome Professor Mariana Mazzucato, Professor on Economics of Innovation and Public Value from the University College of London, who will give a valuable comment on the paper. We look forward to benefit from her experience in this area. We hope that the session will lead us to think on how we can harness innovation and modern industries to build a more sustainable economy for Palestine. Now we give the floor to Dr. Grace Khoury to start the session. Wish you a productive session. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Our theme for this session is the opportunities for sustainable development. It is difficult to speak of sustainable development in Palestine because our understanding of sustainable development contradicts with the international definitions given to the term, because we are going through a very difficult situation. Sustainable development to us, or our ability to survive and be resilient, is what development to us means. But the first pillars of sustainable development include political stability and finding a permanent settlement for the Palestinian question that will give us freedom of movement, control of our crossing points, and the ability to access our natural resources, including water, land, and energy. So these are important pillars. The other pillars of sustainable development are public policies that promote sustainable development, mobilization of financial resources to enable us to implement the policies of sustainable development. Other pillars include partnership among different sectors, including the government sector, civil society, higher education establishments, and the private sector. This partnership is also important for a sustainable development strategy. And then comes innovation and creativity and the role in sustainable development. The paper that will be presented by Mr. Zain, he invites for this kind of partnership among all partners in order to harmonize the industrial innovation policies with our plans for recovery after the current situation and the aggression on Gaza. So it is part of the understanding of industrial development. Industrial development, no doubt, is one of the key tenets of a development economy that lead to increasing GDP. It also diversifies the economic activity and leads to economic growth. Industrial development also increases the human resources capital and increases employment, reduces unemployment, leads to an improvement in the infrastructure. It also leads to innovation, creativity. There's no doubt that the industrial sector is an important sector. And I have to mention that in September 2023, the national framework of industrial policy was issued. It was a very comprehensive and holistic framework that analyzed all types of Palestinian industries, their added value, and it was for a 6-year period. The framework was established to improve the situation of the industrial sector for 6 years, to 2024 to 2029. The pledged funding for this development was around $180 million. In the paper that Mr. Zain will present, it is said that during the first 4 months of the war, the industrial sector lost about $800 million. So the question is, what will be the cost after this assault on Gaza, especially on the industrial sector? What will be the cost? What will be the priorities? And we ask if there is a review of this framework that was prepared before this war. Now, I will give the floor to Mr. Zain Abu Daqqa from the Institute of Social and Economic Progress, entitled Innovation and Industrial Policy, Harnessing the Knowledge Economy for Rehabilitation and Recovery After the War on Gaza. After he presents his paper, we will have a comment by Professor Mariana Mazzucato, who is a professor of economics of innovation and public value from University College London. First, we give the floor to Mr. Zain Abu Daqqa to present his paper. Hello, everybody. I am a bit sick, so I will be speaking in a low voice, but I'll try to make it clear. First of all, I will be speaking of innovation in general terms first. I will not be speaking of policies in terms of the support we need for the innovation sector today. But when we say we want to promote the innovation sector, we need to specify the areas of innovation that we will focus on, because we do not have infinite resources to promote innovation. Therefore, we need to have 3 or 4 key areas on which we can focus our innovation policies. Today, there is a situation triggered by the war on Gaza that created a huge gap in the industrial sector. But at the same time, it created an opportunity. It could be negatively seen in this situation, but it's an opportunity to use innovation to serve the industrial sector, but also we can use the industrial sector to innovate and solve some of the problems that need to be solved in the recovery process, the early recovery first, and development recovery then. Before I start the paper, I will elaborate on the data used. We used mainly data from the Central Bureau of Statistics, and several data was produced about the economic performance in general, whether it be the performance of factories or employment in factories. But there remained gaps regarding the subsectors of the industrial sector. And there are also gaps in understanding the nature of difficulties faced by factories. Therefore, we also relied on two surveys carried out by the Federation of Industries, one of them with appreciated funding from the quartet, and the second was sponsored by the UN. Although these surveys do not represent an alternative to a comprehensive statistical report, because we need a comprehensive census of the needs of factories, but in the absence of this comprehensive document, they give us a hint of where we are. First, as it was mentioned, in the first 4 months, the Central Bureau of Statistics estimated that less than $800 million were the losses of the industrial sector. The Gaza Strip, almost 100% destruction. It was less in the West Bank, but the impact in the West Bank was also wide, probably not by destroying the factories, but also in loss of contracts, in dismissing many staff members, and halting, freezing the activity of factories, which entail losses for maintenance and other reasons. This is important. In Gaza in particular, not only the factories were destroyed, but also the infrastructure of electricity was demolished, which is the backbone of the industrial sector. In the West Bank, based on the study carried out by the Federation of Industries, 67% or 77% or most of the factories cannot collect their receivables, and 45% of the factories cannot repay their loans. Also, trade was affected severely. Not only importation, which was more severely affected, but also exportation, largely because it's exportation to Israel mainly. So for different reasons, this was affected. The last point, which has also an impact on a large segment of the population, is employment. In Gaza, almost all people who worked in factories are now unemployed. In Gaza, we speak of about 15% based on the survey of the Federation of Industries. What is the long-term or structural impact that is taking place now, even if the war stops tomorrow? First of all, the resources, as it was mentioned before, there was a plan to subsidize the industrial sector, and now these resources are being depleted. Also, in Gaza, we speak of needs of 40 to 50 billions before the teams go to assess the losses on the ground. And issues like innovation, investment, and things that were less needy for reconstruction, they will have less focus because they may be seen as secondary. The second thing is reliance on Israel for export and import is already creating a problem for the economy. It will create a bigger problem because, as you see in this graph, the companies that used to import raw material from Israel are the companies that are most affected and harmed. So, if we come to a stage where the restrictions will continue and increase, this means that our reliance on the Israeli market in terms of imports and exports will create a bigger problem in the future. Second is Area C. Area C, we do not control from before, but now there is an acceleration base of settlement expansion and plans to annex it. And these are important for the industries, whether to expand the industrial areas or for the energy infrastructure or the resources in these areas, which were not used before. But if there is annexation, the probability of using these resources will be nil. Based on these paradigms, and that today we don't have a clear picture of the system of governance in Gaza after the war, I tried not to focus on government policies because it is not clear what kind of government, but I am focusing on general innovation frameworks that if we focus on, they could have a positive effect. However, even if we want to deal with minimum level of what we can spend or the resources we need, there is a minimum level of things that must be available to have industrial development, which was weak to start with in Gaza. When I say this, I'm not speaking in absolute terms, even partly available. There could be a chance for development. Without this, no. First is entry and exit of goods and raw material. In a place like Gaza, if we cannot have a flow of raw material in full, it doesn't matter how innovative we are in building in innovating construction material, they will not suffice to fulfill all the construction needs. And also control parts of the infrastructure. So if we want to reduce our dependency for electricity on Israel, it will be the same principle. If we cannot have control on any part of the infrastructure in Gaza, I don't know how it will be in Gaza after the war, but this makes development almost impossible. Third, availability of funding, because all of these are costly. And as I mentioned before, there will be many needs. So if there are no resources, it will be impossible. However, under all these difficulties, and strategically speaking, under the current situation, if the war stops, what needs to be done? I will speak a bit of Gaza and a bit of the West Bank. For the West Bank, where the situation is much better, but is still difficult, the most important thing to happen is stabilization. To try to maintain a certain level of stability and to make sure that the existing factories will not dismiss more people and that it will be more or less to maintain a certain rate of sale and increase their sale in order to try to stop depending on the Israeli market, because dependence on the Israeli market triggers further problems. In Gaza, one of the studies carried out by the Federation of Industries speak of 15% of the factories that have not been damaged. So there is a minimum level of production that can be resumed more quickly than others. And there is another part, more than 15%, which is only partly destroyed. So it can be repaired with less material. So the focus here is on reviving a minimum level of production focusing on more strategic sectors like food processing. For example, importation of food in Gaza will be difficult, so we need to work on agricultural related industries that provide food to more people will be an important focus. Where can there be innovation in industries? First, There were many ideas of replacing imports and using local products to replace imports. But there was no focus on the inputs of this industry. A while ago, when the PNA tried to replace calves and to initiate an industry of meat locally, the real problem, probably it was not fully discussed, but 70% of the cost of maintaining a calf until it is slaughtered is the feedling, which is made by 4 products that we import. So between the feeding that we import and the input that we import to produce the feeding, we produce between 200 to 300 million dollars a year. We can, even if we replace 5 million of these imports, this will be okay. So we also export scrap metal, and we cannot remanufacture them. So this is an area of innovation. It's very important because we can replace many of the imports by using these metals to produce raw material and sustain our industries. These solutions are not comprehensive. It will not cover us for 100%, but it will make a real difference. The second point, which is cost effective, is information systems. In the industrial sector and in productive sectors in general, companies are facing information-related problems. First, development of products. When a factory or any company tries to develop a product, its understanding of the market needs, whether they be domestic markets or foreign markets, is limited. It's not because they don't look for this information, but because access to this information quickly in a usable manner for production purposes is not easy. So this is also an area to provide more information, more employable information, and more consumable information by the private sector. Relating to imports and exports, there is a lot of information that because of the occupation, we have restrictions on when we can import or export and how it can go. There were many studies on this point, and to provide quick information on this timing of exports and imports is very important. Many factories have good products, but their access to market is difficult. The mechanism of access to local and international consumers is difficult. So having information on how to enable factories and companies to outreach consumers is important. Today, we have the technology. Sharing information became easier. So it could be an effective means and cost-effective means to improve the situation. Last point is energy. Availability of energy for factories relates mainly to infrastructure, whether it be in area AC, which is under the authority of the occupation. But there are many things that we can do, even at the level of the factory itself, at term level. First, to measure the consumption of energy. Some factories are doing this, and they are calculating their consumption of electricity and if their consumption of electricity is efficient or not. And there are audits that can be carried out. We can go to companies and see how much they consume in terms of electricity and how they can use energy more efficiently by using insulation systems and other systems. There is something which started costly, but it's becoming less expensive, is to store energy. A large part of the problem using solar energy is to redistribute the energy into the infrastructure and send it back to the grid. which is a complicated system. But today, there is a possibility to store energy. It will not help us to do without the grid totally, but at the level of the factory or industrial area, it can provide certain level of energy that can be used more effectively. So we have to increase our use of solar energy, and I'll stop here. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Zain.
Okay,
Professor
Mazzucato,
Mazzucato.
thank you for being with us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you to the Prime Minister Mustafa and Dr. Nabil Kassis and Raya Khalidi and to the whole Palestinian Economic Policy Research Institute, MAS, for inviting me to join this event. I remember in December 2020 giving the Yusuf Saeed Development Lecture for MAS. So it's wonderful to be back, but it's absolutely terrible to be back under the conditions that you are under. Thank you especially to this wonderful paper, to Zain Abu Dhaka for presenting it, and I'm very happy to give my comments. I especially liked how you began by really highlighting the connection between development and innovation. I often say innovation is development policy, and development should be about innovation policy. Unfortunately, these are often in different domains, both in terms of academia, but also where people talk about them in government. And your paper is excellent in how it brings it together, but through a focus on the problems around energy, around information, of course, the problems around health, and your huge problems around the housing that has been destroyed. I think the paper does an excellent job at demonstrating the devastating impacts that the Israeli occupation, even pre-war, post-war, is having on Palestine, and provides key insights, and this is what's so important, key insights on how to turn the challenges, the tragedy into potential opportunities for innovation and really economy-wide innovation. We should remember that all the different areas that you talk to us about require also government to change. This is not about the Ministry of Innovation. This is really about the Health Ministry, an Innovation Ministry, a Finance Ministry, those who have to deal with energy and information to work together in order to actually solve the problems. An innovation that in fact is problem-oriented always needs interdepartmental, interministerial thinking at the government level, but in the private sector level, it needs intersectoral. All the different sectors and the businesses in Palestine, we need to think about all the different solutions that are required from public and private investment in terms of how we build, how we eat, how we move. And this is what you mean by an opportunity for innovation around these key problems. So I've organized my comments around 3 different areas. The first is really just to highlight that what you obviously both imply explicitly and implicitly, that none of what we're talking about today can happen if the occupation continues. I think it's such an important point that the occupation is at the heart of the crisis, at the heart of the economic crisis, at the heart of the employment crisis, at the heart of the industrial crisis. So before thinking about how Palestine can rebuild its economy going forwards, we all know that it can only happen if the occupation ends. And the different areas you talk about in the paper, the way that the war in Gaza more recently has devastated the industrial sector, the fact that economic dependency on Israel worsens Palestine's industrial vulnerability, its resilience, the constrained financial resources, which are really limiting any sort of relief and innovation. All these things are the background of your paper, and I think you do an excellent job in providing both the statistics, but really having this as the backdrop, because that's why innovation policy and development policy and the kind of thinking around the geopolitical situation have to be done hand in hand. We cannot allow the silos of those conversations. But moving forwards, as the governments in the West Bank and Gaza consider how to rebuild, this is, as you say, an opportunity to design a very different type of recovery. In other words, a recovery that has the direction of growth, not just its rate, at the center. And I should also add that I do think it's an opportunity for the government itself to change how it operates, because we know there's been problems there. The paper correctly identifies two key issues. One is a set of minimum requirements that need to be met, including entry and exit of goods and independent infrastructure reconstruction. And second, that short-term stabilization as the main priority once the conflict ends. But I think, again, as what you say, and this is really what I want to focus on, it's an opportunity to design a recovery that really uses the different challenges you look at, including the energy, the information, health, and housing, as opportunities for a massive wave that's required of public and private investment, but also in terms of the international support that comes in, which must come in terms of actually helping to collaborate and create collective intelligence around those areas. And there's some really interesting examples, I think, because I think what we all want to foster is a lot of sharing with Palestine, not just collaboration, but sharing lessons of what works and what doesn't. And I just wanted to maybe share some examples, for example, in Brazil, where they have really, with Lula's leadership, put these problems around housing, around health, around food at the center of how they think about innovation. So again, bringing together what I would call, well, I have called the entrepreneurial state, so an innovation state with a welfare state. So welfare, if we care about the well-being of people and the tragic consequences of the war on Palestine in terms of what it means for everyday life, in terms of the schools, the housing, the health, the energy, how to actually then bring together our understanding of well-being and welfare with innovation. And these require institutions. It doesn't just happen by talking about it. So a good example in Brazil is their health economic industrial complex, which has really designed its industrial base around health innovation to deliver on the government's priority of providing accessible health services for all Brazilians, but also healthy food. So the school meal program in Brazil is about making sure that every child has every day 3 healthy meals, but also meals that come from a more sustainable form of production. And the Ministry of Health designed something called productive development partnerships, PDPs. These are agreements between the government and the private pharmaceutical industry around, for example, vaccine production. And to initiate a PDP, several prerequisites must be met, including first, technology transfer and sharing of intellectual property rights. So we don't just have, this is an opportunity for the private sector just to, if you want, privatize every little bit of the production. There's IP sharing. Second, having a Brazilian public entity in the government capable of actually facilitating that technology absorption. And third, local manufacturing requirements, making sure that these PDPs actually lead to new skills, new training at the very, very local level. And it's due to these requirements, those 3 requirements, that the PDPs have led to price reductions of up to 30% for strategic health products, yielding significant savings for the Ministry of Health. But what's interesting, Danny Roderick and I actually wrote a paper around this on the conditionalities, these requirements. It's not about making a long list, but the more that they can be specific, the more that then they will require the private sector to innovate and to invest in order to meet a public goal. I wrote the book Mission Economy because, in fact, even to get to the moon, they had to think about, what would the astronauts wear? How would they move? How would they eat? How would they go to the bathroom? And it was solutions to those problems that got us baby diapers, baby formula, insulation. So thinking about all the different problems that Palestine is facing today and thinking about problem-oriented partnerships and also problem-oriented parts of the government, which try to foster bottom-up solutions in the private sector for very specific public needs. And that then, if you want, shapes a more mutualistic, symbiotic relationship between the public and private actors, instead of what? Instead of what we have sometimes had or often have, which is you just have, some subsidies, some guarantees given to the private sector, and then a very low quality outcome because there's no real strong mission and solution that's being sought. And this need to develop more symbiotic partnerships can really be done by thinking of creative conditionalities at the center of these purpose-oriented partnerships. Another point is that the paper really looks at how we might require import substitution to drive economic diversification and sectoral transformation. And I think here again, it's important to consider, especially in the areas where there is some expertise, like in stone and marble industries and the leather industries that the paper talks about, the degree to which diversification has not always been the outcome of import substitution. Experiences in Latin America have shown that sometimes, when not very well structured, import substitution strategies haven't necessarily worked. They're highly vulnerable to economic shocks and create an overdependence on domestic markets, which is, of course, an issue when those markets are very small. And so it's not to say that import substitution is not the solution, but it really should go hand in hand with more explicit attempts to diversify these markets. It's interesting, given your last comments on the information sector, to think of the new digital services that are required actually to make sure that production in these areas, like the marble sector, like the leather sector, actually are transformed into more sustainable and inclusive practices. It's interesting to consider, again, global lessons, how Denmark has become the #1 provider of high-tech digital services for lowering the material content of production. They're the #1 providers, by the way, to China, which is a massive country. Denmark is tiny. Of course, a very different context from Palestine. But the point is, going up the value chain of these markets, not only in the traditional way of how we think of going up the value chain, but in terms of the diversification of the digital services that can help those sectors transform in a more inclusive and sustainable direction. And lastly, in terms of thinking about this idea of directed growth and purpose-oriented growth, of course, water is a huge area, I think, that maybe the paper can consider, the author and your colleagues. The West Bank and Gaza are extremely water stressed and face very, very high levels of water pollution. Access to improved water in Gaza has dropped from near universal coverage 2 decades ago to almost zero in all areas of the region. Something like 108,000 cubic meters of untreated or partially treated wastewater are disposed of daily into the sea or the Gaza Valley due to this overloaded and poor functioning wastewater treatment plants, meaning that the coastal environment is really, really heavily contaminated. And I just had the honor to chair the Global Commission on the Economics of Water. We published our first report just a month ago. And we think of this kind of mission-oriented approach, which I've been advocating for some time, to industrial strategy. Again, big problems that require many different sectors to innovate. But the water-related missions, I think, are super relevant to Gaza and well, to all of Palestine. We talk about 5 different missions. The first, to launch a new revolution in food systems. The second, to conserve and restore natural habitats critical to protecting green water, not just blue water. That means also the biodiversity. The third, establishing a circular water economy. The fourth, to enable a clean energy and AI-rich era with lower water intensity. We know that many natural resources, when they're extracted, overuse water. And the fifth, which I think is really important right now during post-war recovery, hopefully, is to ensure that no child die from unsafe water by 2030. So using a mission like that to drive an industrial strategy around public and private investment to make sure that no child in Palestine dies from unsafe water by 2030 could be very interesting, I think, to focus the mind on all the different sectors, including digital sectors, that will be required to invest and innovate towards that. So just to conclude, I really think the paper is excellent, both in terms of the context, but also the different examples and the categories of industrial policy areas. And I just want to add that I think it's a great setting and paper to really think more about this directed, purpose-oriented industrial strategy, a mission-oriented one, which really requires also changing the mind to not think of welfare here, innovation there, but using the key welfare problems to drive economy-wide innovation and for the government itself to become a bit more dynamic in terms of the PNA, to really think in an interministerial way, and definitely to use any international support that arrives to put it at the center of the innovation strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for your valuable comments. Thanks. ناخد أسئلة. تفضلي.
Let's open the floor for questions. Best of health, everyone. We have learned a lot from what was said. We have worked on this industrial policy. I would just like to give you an overview. We have worked on the industrial overview with the partnership with the private sector, because industry is the private sector is the driver for the industrial sector. Secondly, we have conducted a full analysis on the demand and supply and the because I needed to understand the Palestinian situation, so we needed to do consultation sections with all the sectors, even with nationwide in Palestine, including West Bank and Gaza. We always communicate with Gaza. We came up, usually the policy is not a short-term policy, it's a long-term policy. However, due to the Palestinian situation, we had to have it a short-term, mid-term, and long-term. And we set the plans for the short term. I'm not going to list the programs, but we all know the pillars because we all know the problems that face the private sector, including the environment for investment, whether it's the legislation, infrastructure, or lack of competitiveness and productivity. All these issues are included, but we came up with 12 programs in order for us to be able to work. The most important program was innovation. Innovation in industry is totally different than any other sector. In innovation, we believe that we need to link it with the higher education, with universities, because to be honest, innovation requires the capacity to ensure that the students have a high capacity to learn. So we wanted to link the universities with innovation, and in order for to find innovative solutions to solve the problems. And soon we're going to have the very first, whereas we're going to sign a memorandum of understanding with the Polytechnic University, and in the in the southern part in Hebron, and therefore we're going to link that with industry, and even the seminars in universities are going to be solving problems for the industrial sector, and this would be the main hub for innovation at the university. And us as the public sector, private sector, and academia would all be part of this. So it's not only that the government would work on this, it would also include the private sector, and the Union for Industries would also be involved. And therefore, what made us stop for a while is that we were actually at an international conference on the industrial policies, and we were very proud to be there as Palestinians, because we were on par with the international approaches, and we were very proud, as they say, despite of all the challenges that we face. But the problem is that the trauma that the industrial sector suffered due to the aggression on Gaza, first we need to give a priority to recovery. However, despite that, even despite the war in Gaza, most of the industrial sector is on halt. However, many of the factories are starting to work. They're trying to find innovative solutions from raw materials. They're just gathering it from the rubble. Whatever they find, they're trying to have 320 factories are back to work with basic input. So sometimes with having a problem or being under stress, we come up with innovative solutions. And honestly, when we're talking about the raw material, which is the lack of it, creates a problem, especially for dual use. There were many who were improvisers, where they would find and they would improvise and find a raw material that would work as an alternative. This is something that we really focus on. If I have such materials, what is the alternative for me as Palestine? We need to work with universities in order to find alternatives for raw materials. Of course, there's no way to have only one thing. There's always alternatives that's why we should always look into that. We do work on energy, and industry without energy is nothing. We all know how important energy is. We work on clean energy. We also work on um, energy auditing, and my colleague Said has worked on that on one of the programs that we audit the factories and try to find solutions and alternatives. As for scrap, when we give ideas, we have to look at the Palestinian situation. How are we going to solve the energy problem? I have one factory to for melting purposes, but we have to think that export is needed for a trade deficit. So I would have to trade that. Thank you. I to introduce myself, Dr. Saeed Dwekat. I work with UNIDO as a national coordinator in Palestine for the regional programs. I'm also an instructor at the Najah University. Best of health to everyone. Thank you. But I would have liked to see more in depth on industry, because industry is really a core issue that we should look into. Today, we're looking at the key indicators in the country in Palestine. We have to get back to the statistics to prior to war to use it as a base year. And the Ministry of Industry used to employ 30,000 employee, and in industry there's about over 20 some micro, small, and big enterprises, and those are the ones registers at the Ministry of Industry, which includes 3,500 companies as a whole. So if we were to look at the international indicators, how they classify Palestine, how UNIDO has their own classification, which is called competitive and industrial performance. In Palestine, we're listed at number 114. So this number is taken into consideration for several criteria. How much does industry comprise out of the GDP? How many in terms of labor? What's its percentage, and so on. So in order not to take much of your time, my PhD was on industrial SMEs in Palestine and the strategic enablers for sustainability on this topic. I can say that Palestine industry in Palestine, specifically the private sector, is suffering three types of problems. Under each of these categories, there's a whole list of problems, of course, but the first is substantial, which is relevant to the Israeli occupation. You're all experts and professors in economy. You all know how much the occupation is costing us, 3.5 to 5 billion per year. And that's only if we take the alternative solution on how the Israelis are exporting or how much they're making money out of settlements, about $20 billion per year. So that means we don't need international community. If we get rid of the occupation, we have the resources to sustain ourselves. And what I'm saying, that should be doable for us to work on, and it's an emergency for us to work on it. The second category, which I call in my own school of thought, is that after all the literature review and working in the field for over 20 years, I can call it structural, enabling environment for all the private sector, specifically the industrial sector. We find that this topic has not ripened yet. If I were to register a company, I could do so in one day, but in order to license a factory, it could take me 3 years to do so. We don't have synergy or a one-stop shop, which we're trying to do so, where the Ministry of Industry is trying to work on creating that in order to ensure that it would be an effective one-stop shop that would help people to invest in industry. Also, the laws and legislations up until now, they have not been updated, and they're creating quite an issue due to the loopholes that it have. So we need to create an environment. If I want to bring any investor to any industrial zone, if they want to get a return on their taxes or a tax return, even if the agreement accepts that, it would take them 2 years to be able to get their tax return or to get the customs return. So a legal environment is within our control and not up to the occupation. So it's something so we should do. And there's another issue which is urgent, which I would link it to the innovation that Mr. Zain has brought up. If this is problems at the firm level. In Palestine, most of our companies are family businesses, and based on experience, family businesses in the second and third generation, either these companies would have to start having sub companies because the brothers would do so, or these companies would just close up. And this is a threat because we have a high risk for family business and the sustainability of family businesses. So what are the reasons for these problems? First of all, we do not have a constitution for family businesses. We do not have institutionalization for these. We don't have the infrastructure and all the systems and development system, which I would link all this to innovation. In my opinion, innovation is quite a large topic, and we can identify the priorities of innovation. Are we going to adopt, for instance, productive innovation, service innovation, supply chain innovation? We really have to focus on specific sectors and specific topics or themes in order for us to work on. I believe that industry should take a priority and should have more attention, because today we have 300,000 employees who were working in Israel. Today they have no other way to turn to except industry. So we really have to work on industry. And I believe the enabling environment is the most important driver that would help the companies to support themselves. Thank you.
Speaking on my personal as Misyef, industrial policies is an important issue. I say there are no industrial policies in Palestine till today. The government has neglected this issue for years. And as an evidence, when I was talking with Manal when she presented these projects and innovation, the industry contribution to GDP in the past 10 years has been deteriorating, about 11%. And to me, this is the most important indicator to indicate whether there is a policy or not. What are the industrial policies? Everybody uses this term. What are they? Industrial policies are simply the trade policies, import and export, tax policies, investment specifications and standards, and licensing policies, as well as the procedures and legal framework which should govern these industries. These are the industrial policies. Each one of these policies has a major problem, and they are full with gaps. So this is the first point I wanted to mention. Therefore, it is important to reconsider or restructure and to take all these industrial policies in Palestine, which actually do not exist. They are only on paper, but they are not being applied. The second point, there is a confusion about terms when you use about replacing imports or having substitutes to imports. So we want to substitute imports. It means that I don't want to buy this chair imported from Israel. I want to bring it from a third party other than Israel. This is replacement. But if we want to nationalize products, it means that I can first replace the import from Israel, and then I can make final production here, because there are products that come. There is the raw material, there is the intermediary industry, and there is the final product. So which area are we going to target to replace imports? The example of calves was not a good example for industry, but it's agriculture. But calves in Israel represent 70%. So it's the same cost here in Israel. What is the difference? Israel first it does not produce calves and does not produce feedings. Israel imports animal feed. The difference is the industrial and agricultural policies provided by the state to farmers. We don't have this here. So where is the role of innovation? You spoke in general about this, but I believe innovation. So when I want to breed calves and cows, I have to, how can I provide the raw material or the animal feed that I need to breed these calves or cows? So innovation is there, but it's being neglected. There are tens of patents registered at the Ministry of Economy, but they have not been followed. There are tens of patents that failed because their owners did not stay here to build on their work. So we need to put this point for discussion and focus on it. Thank you. Now we give the floor to the presenter to answer, and then to our commenter professor. So let's see if they have any other questions first.
هيك تمام. لا مش دكتور أول شيء شكرا جميعا.
First of all, thank you for your feedback. Many of them are well said, and I want to mention a few points. I will start with the CAF example. I work in business entrepreneurship. We invest in the IT sector in particular, and now we're working in the data sector. And then we used to be more general. Since the first 3 investments we made, there was animal feed. We carried out a study. There's agricultural waste in Palestine that can replace about 15 to 20% of all the animal feed we are importing. There is the palm waste, other agricultural waste from beans and from the flour factories, that is for sesame hulls, and technology. With minimum technology, you can convert into this waste and solve the problem partly. You are importing 250 million at minimum to feed the cattle you have. So if you spend 100 million to replace 250 million and recycle this waste, it's worth it. So this was the comment. But it's correct, this is not the only problem. Another comment. Today, there are many sectors, including the private sector, that started to invest in innovation, including the health sector. The health sector today, there are some hospitals that started to invest in information system for commercial purposes, not only for developmental purposes. So it's profit-making effort. So we have pharmaceutical companies that are advanced and have reached advanced stages. They work on generic medicines. So we have hospitals as well that can localize many of the services that we import today. So this also is an important area to cover. And it can be done quickly. But there's a more important thing. My impression in talking to many of people who have an influence in the area of innovation and technology in Palestine, when they speak of this as if the private sector is that this is something that is exclusive to the private sector, but this is not correct. There isn't any state that succeeded in the IT sector without the intervention of the state. The state is the motor engine. Without a state intervention, it does not help. This is difficult. Administratively speaking, it is difficult. The situation we go through is difficult. But what I try to do, not involve, there are always things that can be added. But as the professor said, if we find the area of innovation and have a project and a plan, it will make it easier for other companies. Startups, 97% of them in the world fail. But 3/4 of the problems they face is in identifying the problem that caused their failure. If you work to solve a wrong problem, you can invest for years and you'll be spending, but you'll be solving anything, you will fail. If you don't want to fail, the most important thing is to identify the area or the problem. If we identify 3 or 4 sectors or domains that we focus on, we can start solving the problems of the private sector. And this is an example. Professor Mazzucato?
Final comments based on the discussion? Thank you.
Yes, I found the discussion super interesting because it touched on, I think, four key areas. And the first, actually, umbrella area, which was just highlighted, is we really need to go beyond ideology. There's too many critical problems to pretend this is about just the private sector or just the public sector. This is about forging the key partnerships that currently don't exist precisely because of the weak industrial strategy. Anytime there's a weak industrial strategy, there's too little investment, there's inertia. And industrial strategy done well in a problem-oriented way with all the problems around health, around energy, around housing, can become stimulants to having an investment-led recovery in Palestine. One point that was raised, which is very important around universities, absolutely, but they're not always useful, right? Sometimes they themselves are part of the problem. So using this as an opportunity to rethink also the science industry linkages and the national system of innovation and the role of universities in that, critical. Second, people raised in the questions issues around laws and regulations. Of course, they're important, and we must make sure we have the right systems. The one-stop shops, the ability to set up companies easily, turning patents that was mentioned into real innovation instead of patents being blocked. Absolutely. However, that's not ever going to be enough. It's critical, it's a necessity, but it's not enough. What we need then to go beyond the ideology is to really also pick some tools. So we have the problems, around energy, again, around health, around materials, around information. But then how do we use this opportunity, this moment, in terms of changing the tools so we actually have an entrepreneurial state that can help the private sector and work well together? And just one example, and I will shut up, is procurement. In the US, for example, I wrote a whole book about this, The Entrepreneurial State, where, as our author said, all the technology in our iPhones was actually state funded. But what was interesting about the United States was they used the tool of procurement, so government purchasing, to actually create a market. So not market fixing, but market creating for those small companies, which then scaled, the startups scaled through this market creation process through procurement. And countries have learned from this. So every department, health, energy, defense, can have maybe 5% of its budget dedicated to procuring in or more solutions from small, medium enterprises. And that creates markets for these companies. Otherwise, they're just there, but they don't scale. And an example really interesting is, I think, the one I mentioned already around school meals. If school meals have to be healthy, tasty, and sustainable, they need to be purchased in, and that creates an innovation challenge for the whole supply chain of food for those small and local companies providing it to actually innovate in order to provide it. And thinking about the ways to structure procurement so it can play this market creation role for small companies is a different way to think about small company policy. Instead of just helping small companies, they become part of the solution to satisfy needs, but then what they get back is a market so they can scale. Thank you. Great. Thank you. And I'm happy to help anytime.
We don't have time. We don't want to forget that our industrial companies are family businesses, as it was mentioned. Innovation requires a huge investment for research and development. And for the limited resources and the lack of an enabling environment, many laws need to be revised and revisited to promote the industrial sector. We will stop here because the comments were very valuable.